Okay, good morning. Thanks for joining in today. And let's start with the second learning outcome with regards to, the unit we are studying, which is infectious diseases. So in this second learning outcome, we're going to be looking at, understanding vector-borne disease transmission. So we came across this particular term called vector yesterday, and vectors are basically, organisms or microorganisms which basically can have DNA, and that DNA basically looks at infecting, other hosts. So we look at what are vector-borne diseases, what are vectors, and take up an example of one particular vector-borne disease which can be transmitted amongst humans, and we look at that in a bit more detail. So there is only one assessment criteria in today's session, and we are looking at just understanding learning outcome 2, which is vector-borne diseases and its transmission. And we will look at through an example of how different vectors, obviously we'll go into different vectors because there are different types, and how they basically enable transmission of diseases amongst humans. So let me just switch over to a presentation. We've got a few slides that we'll cover today, and this would basically be useful in terms of understanding, vector-borne diseases and how, this typically tends to transmit, how vectors essentially tend to transmit diseases, in or amongst humans. So let me just switch you over, and we'll start with that. So when we look at learning outcome 2, we are looking at understanding vector, what is a vector, and what are vector-borne diseases. So we'll be looking at some of the indicative content which talks about an example of how mosquito or the malaria larvae actually transmits from the Anopheles mosquito into humans, and then it causes, malarial fever. There are other forms of, vectors that we'll also be looking at. Say, for example, the Lyme disease in particular, which is caused by, ticks. And then we look at rabies, which is caused by, dog bites or, essentially other types of carnivore animals like mouse, rabbits, and others. And they are also going to be termed as vectors. So let's start off with understanding what is a vector. Now, when we talk about vectors, and in general, when we think of let's say carriers. So I would put it this way: that vectors are essentially, let's say, look at an example would be to start off with giving you an example that I would normally give is that a vector refers to essentially an organism or some sort of a DNA which essentially has the ability to carry or transmit infectious diseases. And this is considered any such host which basically has the ability or the DNA essentially to transmit diseases or transmit or cause widespread transmission of diseases, then would be termed as a vector. Now, vector is related to a branch of biology which is called immunology. And when we look at, as I mentioned the word yesterday, pathogen and pathology labs. So here what we are looking at is, typically organisms or organisms in the form of DNA in particular, which can bring about, some sort of a reaction within a host body would be termed as a vector. Now, when we look at vectors, we also define that they have a host cell and they have a molecular structure. And this molecular structure has some DNA components, which is your basic genes or chromosomes or the genetic material, as we call it. And this genetic material has the capability to be able to produce, or carry, code which can lead to diseases. Now, when we look at vectors, sometimes, as I mentioned yesterday in one of the in the lectures, is that one of the instances that you can have is that your body could be immune to the disease, but you can be carrying that disease, and then when you get in touch or come in contact with somebody else, that can transmit that disease to the other person. And in those cases, you are termed as a vector because you are the carrier of the disease, although you are immune to that particular, pathogen itself. And this is because of the body, because of your genetics and your body being able to develop what is called immunity. Now, when we look at when we in general look at the definition of vector, what we are also looking at is, if I show you this particular image, what we are looking at is that this could be a molecule. And as I've shown in the picture, there are different types of vectors. So we'll go into detail of that, but a vector could just be a DNA code. It could be a molecule. It could be rodents. It could be mosquitoes. It could be, butterflies. It could be all different sorts of, animals which could act essentially as a living organism or have some sort of living component in it, which is the DNA or the genetic code, and have the capability to transmit infection to a number of other animals or different types of animals. And when we look at the definition of, the vector from a point of view of molecular biology, we basically say it's a foreign DNA which has entered your body. And that foreign DNA basically then is able to cause reactions which could be infectious, which could lead to illness, or which could lead to some sort of allergic reaction or diseases. Now, when we see pollen, and again, this is an example when during summers, when we see the pollen content to be high amongst in the air, what we generally get to see is that some of us can get an allergic reaction to the high content of pollen in the air. And that could be, say, for example, some of us get fever, some of us can get running nose, some of us sneeze to a certain extent. And this is your body adjusting to the foreign DNA or the foreign material which is, coming into your body. Now, the symptoms of what people get, when they ingest pollen or when they breathe in pollen does not, sometimes what I want to say is it is not generally fatal. It will cause some sort of a reaction, and the reaction would basically, put your body into a bit of an overdrive, and that would be the body fighting the, foreign DNA or the outside material which has entered your body in order to minimize some sort of reaction. But when we look at vectors in general, what we are going to also do is classification of vectors, and vectors can be plasmids, they can be viral vectors, they can be, DNA, and we will go into that classification primarily because we need to understand that different forms of vectors essentially can cause different types of diseases in humans. Now, what we also want to look at is the term or the terminology, which is vector-borne diseases. Now, when we talk about vector-borne diseases, what we are looking at is vector-borne diseases tend to be diseases which could be, a result from an infection which is transmitted, say, from humans to animals, from other animals to humans. These could be, let's say the carriers in this case, or the pathogens in this case, or the vectors in this case, whichever way you call it, the carriers, essentially the vectors in this case could be mosquitoes, ticks, flies, different forms of, I would say, animals, which would basically then lead to some sort of a foreign DNA entering your body. Now, when we talk about vector-borne diseases, we are talking about illnesses which are transmitted to humans and animals through bites of these vectors. That means through basically, foreign DNA or some sort of when this DNA or this particular, vector, if it's a mosquito, it could be a bite. If it is rabies, it could be a bite. We talk about, dengue fever, obviously caused by a mosquito, it is a bite. So generally, they are classified as that these animals or, vectors, which are basically carriers of diseases, will essentially be infecting humans and other animals through the process of bites. Now, in some cases, arthropods, or, when we talk about, in general, when we look at different kingdoms of, how animal classification is done. So when we look at lower classification, we have crustaceans, we have insects, we have arachnids, scorpions, centipedes. So when we talk about arthropods in general are a diverse group of invertebrates. That means they don't have a spinal system, but they would essentially be animals which will be causing infection basically through the route of biting or their exoskeleton. Now, this could mean that when we talk about, scorpions, insects, cockroaches, spiders. These are basically categorized as arthropods. Now, one of the things that we commonly know, and when we discussed yesterday, was bed bugs. Now, bed bugs is a category of arthropods which basically can bite and obviously can cause blisters or some sort of, swelling or fever. And, when we talk about bed bugs in general, what we are looking at is, when we look at bedbug bites, obviously they can, also cause fatal reactions in certain humans if you are susceptible to, say, for example, allergic reactions. But generally, these tend to be bites, they tend to be rashes, or they tend to be, blisters, which over a point in time can be treated with creams or some sort of medication, and they then, help, or basically you go back to normal. Now, some of these can take a few days to heal. Some of these can take a few weeks to heal, depending on how severe the reaction is and how your body essentially reacts. So when we talk about arthropods in general, we are looking at and we look at different types of other vectors, things like mosquitoes, bed bugs, ticks, lices. They are also basically causing this disease or the transmission of the disease essentially through biting as a process. Now, when we talk about the different types of vector-borne diseases, these are diseases which are caused by parasite, viruses, and bacteria, which can act as carriers. And these carriers, when they come in contact with your body or other forms of animal and their contact, then they would lead to a transmission of disease. Now, this is obviously some statistics which has come from the WHO website, which World Health Organization. Now, there are over 700,000 deaths which happen from a disease like malaria, dengue, schimatosis. We look at African trypanosis, which is primarily wild, West Nile virus fever, and Legionnaire's disease, Chagas disease, yellow fever. These are all, or Japanese encephalitis. Now, these are diseases which are predominantly quite serious, and these are diseases which are primarily caused by the bite of a typical type of mosquito or a typical type of, vector or carrier. Now, a couple of months back, if you recall, during the summer months and in rainy season, British citizens are warned by the Foreign Commonwealth Office to say that if you're traveling to Japan, please make sure that you are, you have had the appropriate vaccination, because Japanese encephalitis is fatal. And if not treated within 24 to 48 hours, the person can, I say fatal, person can die. So these are, let's say, announcements which are done primarily by the governments and different, healthcare departments to basically sensitize people on the seriousness of some of these vector-borne diseases, because they can lead to death if they are not treated, or in some cases they can be fatal. And that would mean that you have to be prepared if you're visiting certain countries or certain places wherein it is known that these vectors are going to be present during certain seasons. So vector-borne diseases sometimes are also classified as diseases which are predominantly climate-related. And these climate-related diseases means that the carriers, in this case, mostly say mosquitoes, which I've written here, like malaria, dengue, yellow fever, hay fever, West Nile fever, Japanese encephalitis, is predominantly transmitted through the carrier or vector, in this case, which is mosquito. And excuse me, when we talk about, say, Chagas fever is basically carried by a species of mosquitoes, which is called the Aedes. When we talk about, malarial fever, it is carried by a, species of mosquitoes called Anopheles. And when we talk about encephalitis, it is carried by, obviously the, species in mosquitoes, which basically looks at causing this disease, which is called encephalitis, which is basically your, swelling of your lymphatic vessels. And this primarily is, obviously another species of mosquito. And then when we talk about West Nile fever or fever, when we look at the Nile Delta in particular, which is quite fertile in Africa, and it flows through a number of countries, Culex mosquitoes basically cause, that fever, which is primarily related to, West Nile fever, and that is also fatal. So in general, when we talk about vectors or vector-borne diseases, we are looking at diseases which are transmitted, say, as a bigger category, because this is the biggest category which is transmitted through mosquitoes, and it leads to 700,000 deaths. So you can understand and see from this magnitude that this is just the number of people dying because they do not get treatment on time. And these are all types of diseases which are carried or caused by mosquito as a vector, and it leads to that these are the different biological names that I mentioned here, but what we get to understand and what we read and know as common names tend to be malaria, dengue fever. We've also heard of Zika virus, which is prominent in the Amazon forest and in Brazil. It affects, if kids, if children at the very young age get bitten by Zika virus, then it basically has the ability to deform, which is caused by the Aedes mosquito. It has the ability to basically create birth defects during pregnancy, and this can cause symptoms wherein your liver, liver essentially, can malfunction, brain functions can malfunction, and it leads to the development of, what is called rashes and joint pains. Now, Zika virus, chikungunya, yellow fever, West Nile virus, and you look at dengue fever, Japanese encephalitis, malaria in particular, are the biggest causes of death of humans, because these are diseases transmitted by vector. Now, in this case, the vector is mosquito, maybe different species of mosquito, but these diseases which are caused by vector, carrying that disease and then biting humans or other animals to transmit the disease, tend to be termed as what are called vector-borne diseases. So for today's learning outcome, it is very important to understand what is a vector and what is a vector-borne disease, and how does the transmission in this case happen. So three things that we have learned by going through some key terminology is that vectors are basically microorganisms or DNA or any sort of foreign body or material which can essentially cause some sort of it's a living organism which can cause some sort of infection within humans or other animals. And this particularly, is basically, when I say the types of vectors and who are the culprits who are basically termed as vectors. Vectors can be arthropods, mosquitoes, ticks, flies, fleas, and lice. These are essentially the living organisms which basically transmit the disease, and they are termed as vectors. Now, vectors essentially can be of different types, and that is where we look at their classification into arthropods, which are vectors which normally would cause a bite, and through the process of biting will transmit the poison or the toxins into the body, or inject the foreign body into your body, and that would start leading to reactions, allergy, illness, or symptoms of illness, and obviously at some stage leading to a full-blown disease. You would also have other types of vectors which primarily can be seen by the naked eye, and obviously they also would be looking at the route of biting and then transferring the foreign DNA or the foreign material into your body. Now, when we talk about biological vectors, we differentiate these into two different types. We have biological vectors and mechanical vectors. Biological vectors, so if I mention this here, so there are two types of vectors that we will look at. One would be biological vectors. Now, when we talk about biological vectors, we will look at vectors like mosquito and ticks, which actually carry the pathogen. That means they carry the foreign DNA, and the foreign DNA can multiply within their bodies, but they do not affect the carrier itself. And what they then do is, when they bite another animal or another type of, say, animal or human, then in those cases, these foreign DNAs are transferred to the humans or animals, and this is where it causes the disease. The second type of vector that we talk about is mechanical vector. So when we talk about mechanical vector, what we are essentially looking at is, these are essentially living organisms which will pick up the infectious agents from outside their body and then transmit them through physical contact. So when we look at ticks, obviously they are harmless to humans, but when we look at flies, they are harmless to humans. But their bodies can carry vector passively, and when they get in touch with you in physical contact, that means they sit on your skin or they basically bite your skin, then in those cases, these would be essentially carriers which are going to be mechanical carriers. That means they're the actual foreign DNA or the pathogen is actually carried outside the body of the carrier, and they would basically transfer this carrier or foreign DNA by physical contact or touch with the humans or any other form of animal. And in those cases, you would term them as mechanical vectors. Biological vectors would be within the bodies of the host. So when we look at the malaria larvae or the mosquito carrying it, the female Anopheles mosquito, say for example, carrying it, the foreign DNA or the foreign living organism is within the body of the mosquito, and through the exchange of when the mosquito bites and when it sucks the blood, through that exchange, the foreign DNA is actually transmitted into the human body. So there's a difference between these two, is because mechanical vectors, I could be a mechanical vector, and as I mentioned earlier, that some humans carry diseases, but they are immune to it because they are maybe just outside of their body, and they might transfer it by physical contact, and that would be termed as mechanical vector. But if I have a disease, for example, like an STD or a sexually transmitted diseases, and then when I get in touch with physical contact, that disease or that particular foreign DNA enters the body because I'm infected. Blood transfusion, for example, I'm infected, and if my blood is then given to somebody else, in that case, if I'm seen to be infected and that blood is transfused to somebody else, then in those cases, I am in any case carrying that disease and I'm affected by it, but the other person would also get affected, and in those cases, it will be termed as a biological vector. So that differentiation is something that we need to understand. So we know what is a vector, what are vector-borne diseases, and what are the types of vectors. Now, when we talk about types of vectors, we need to also look at examples. So here in this case, we talk about mosquitoes, which are essentially vectors. We talk about flies, ticks, and we talk about arthropods. And when we talk about mechanical vectors, we could basically see mechanical vectors as mices, as any other form of developed animal which primarily is going to carry the foreign DNA, but the foreign DNA is going to sit outside the body of the carrier, and in those cases you would see them as what are called mechanical vectors. Now, diseases transmitted by vectors are called vector-borne diseases, and many of these diseases can essentially be transmitted either directly or indirectly between animal and humans. Excuse me. So when we talk about, say, for example, diseases which are directly or indirectly transferred between human and animals, they can be termed as examples that I've given here, which are diseases, things like tick-borne encephalitis, West Nile virus, Legionnaire disease. You look at, Congo hemorrhagic fever. We look at Japanese encephalitis, and they would be generally diseases which are basically transmitted either directly or indirectly between human and animals. Now, when we also look at one of the other bits that we need to understand is that we need to understand the classification of vector and how these are classified by WHO or World Health Organization from a point of view of differentiating between the vectors and different types of vectors, what pathogen or foreign body they carry, and what kind of disease they would normally transmit to humans or other animals. So this is a good table that I've created here, which primarily lists down the vector, the carrier essentially, what kind of disease it causes, and what is the type of pathogen or foreign DNA that would be injected or transmitted from humans to animals or animals to animals, thereby leading to this particular type of disease. So when we talk about mosquito in particular, and the reason why this is important is because deaths by mosquito bites causes different types of fevers, and there are over 700,000 deaths which happen every year. So When we look at mosquitoes, they are classified into further 3 different types. You have Aedes mosquito, Anopheles mosquito, and Culex mosquito. And they typically carry different forms of foreign DNA. So when we talk about Aedes mosquito, depending on the region and the geography where they are found, they could lead to a disease called chikungunya, dengue, lymphatic filariasis. They can cause Rift Valley fever, yellow fever, or Zika fever. And in most cases, these are going to be viruses, except lymphatic filariasis, wherein there is a parasite, which normally is the reason why, the it could lead to, say, for example, a death when the Aedes mosquito actually bites. So when we talk about Anopheles mosquito, again, they would carry 2 types of parasites, which is causing diseases like lymphatic filariasis and malaria. Now, you might ask a question: what is lymphatic filariasis? So lymphatic filariasis is primarily, a common word for this is encephalitis. Encephalitis basically means that, it is quite painful because it leads to the ingestion and multiplication of the parasite in your body. And these are basically called worms. And these are called filarial worms. Now, these are microscopic threadworm-like organisms which can infect the human body, and they in particular affect what is called the lymphatic system. How many of you know what is the lymphatic system? So lymphatic system is a group of organs or vessels, and it basically is a part of the human body which basically protects you from infection and keeps your body fluids flowing in your body. So when we talk about lymphatic system in general, if I show you a picture of lymphatic system, these are the various organs which essentially consist of lymphatic system. So you have lymph nodes, basically when you sweat, under armpits, where your lymph node endings are. You would look at appendix, you would look at spleen, thymus, tonsils, and adenoids, and these are all part of your lymphatic system. So these organs are affected by the filarial parasite or the worm, which basically affects your body. Now, what are the effects that this causes? So when I look at, so if I minimize this picture just for the sake and relevance of having it here. Now, when we talk about encephalitis, what it does is basically causes swelling of your lymph nodes or lymph glands. And this would mean that it blocks the flow of fluids within your body. And this can lead to what is called cramps, obviously blockage of circulation of fluids, and this essentially then can be quite fatal in humans, because if your circulation of bodily fluids actually stops, then this can lead to your say, for example, vessels and certain veins bursting, and that can be fatal to humans. So when we talk about filariasis and what normally happens in that, just going to try and pull a picture out to show you what does that mean, or how does it look like. That would essentially be useful, because you would see that, okay, this is a picture that I pulled out from the World Health Organization website, and this gives you an example of what is filariasis. So when we talk about filariasis, this is what happens is that when the mosquito bites, it injects a parasite called filarial worm, which basically starts multiplying in your body. And when the multiplication of this worm happens, it basically starts blocking your lymphatic vessels. Blockage of this lymphatic vessels essentially can be serious. As you can see, it leads to swelling of your vessels, and then finally bursting of your vessels and veins. And this can then be fatal. So when we talk about in general, at this stage, we need to know what is the basic, just not just the basic name, but I would suggest that at least about the disease by Googling it up to find out what is the disease and what kind of symptoms does it, show or persist. So when we talk about other types of vectors and diseases caused by them, we also look at aquatic snails. Now, they caught what is a disease called schimatiasis, And this is again a parasite, which basically, when you are out and about in areas wherein you are in open rivers or water reservoirs and stuff like that, then this is one such place wherein you can get this particular pathogen or parasite, and that would then lead to this form of disease. You have others as well, like black flies, fleas, lice. You look at sandflies, ticks, bugs, and they would have different types of diseases which can be transmitted to humans. Now, the key part that you have to understand is here is the foreign body or the pathogen essentially is a combination of virus, bacteria, parasite, in some cases, an ectoparasite. Anybody, any idea in terms of what is an ectoparasite? Any examples of ectoparasite, or what do you know about ectoparasite?
Yeah, it's parasite that lives outside the body.
That is correct. So, when you look at ticks, for example, which are present on dogs or other forms of pets, when we look at, say, for example, lices, which basically can be in the form of, present in the form of lice in your hair. When you look at bed bugs in particular, bed bugs, the chemical or the biological name of bed bugs is Cymex lecturius. So when they cause a bite, they can remain dormant. When we talk about ectoparasites, what we are looking at is they are specifically a type of pathogen which is basically going to be living externally off the surface of the organism. They do not go into the body. They do not penetrate the body of the organism, or in this case, human or animals. They will typically feed off the host's tissues or blood cells by puncturing into it, but will remain outside the body. So when we talk about ectoparasites, fleas, ticks, lice, mites, they are all going to be in that particular category, and they would cause also some sort of disease or illness within humans. So this table is something that you would need to look at, and then obviously go into a bit more detail by maybe doing a bit of research to understand each of the types of pathogen, and then and maybe through a picture, at least look at raising your knowledge by understanding that what does that look like and what kind of disease or symptom it is actually producing. Because this is all talking about vector-borne diseases essentially that we want to understand for this learning outcome. So just to recap, what is a vector, what is a vector-borne disease, and how they are transmitted and what are the types is what we need to understand to get to grips with this particular learning outcome. Now, the first assessment criteria that we have in this, and only assessment criteria in this learning outcome, is explain how different vectors are able to transmit diseases in humans. Now, if you have done your thorough research using this particular table, then it will be easy for us to pick out one particular vector and explain what are the different types of diseases these vectors can essentially do. And because it says explain and it uses the word S, that means it's plural. That is where I have taken an example of mosquito, because I can see there are 2 or 3 different species of mosquitoes like Aedes, Culex, Anopheles, and they can be used as a good example to explain how vectors can transmit diseases in humans. Now, if we look at going into a bit more detail on this, this is a normal red blood cell. And this is an infected red blood cell that we see under the microscope. Now, when a mosquito bites, it will basically suck some blood. And then that particular bit that we look at in terms of how the mosquito is biting, this is maybe a magnified screenshot of mosquito actually biting. It has a capillary action, which basically, when it's trying to suck the blood off the skin, it then, in this process, actually injects the larvae, the malarial larvae, into the human body or in your bloodstream. So what tends to happen then is that the normal red blood cell, which is what you see essentially here, at some stage gets infected because the larvae which has been injected, by the by the mosquito in your bloodstream, essentially starts to cause, what is called, infection. And this happens when the mosquito starts to basically, not the mosquito, sorry, the larvae in your blood, which is entered, then starts to essentially, multiply in your bloodstream. And that is where your blood cells essentially get, affected. And because when they start getting affected, you don't feel any symptoms to begin with. But at some stage, when the amount of toxins released by these multiplication of these cells increases in the body, that is where it starts to show symptoms of that you are getting fever, you're feeling lethargic, you're feeling sleepy. And that tends to be the case of, how the infections actually get transmitted to the human body. Now, it is going to be easy for us to explain by taking this example because of the fact that we know that there are different species of mosquito. And in order to explain this, we might need one or two examples. Now, what are the four various different species of Plasmodium? Now, this is also an example that I suggest that can be taken. So when you talk about Plasmodium and Plasmodium-related diseases, Plasmodium is basically the malarial parasite. And this malarial parasite is a microorganism that belongs to the genus of which is the genus called Plasmodium. Now, there are over 100 species of Plasmodium, and they would be causing different types of reactions in the human body. Now, if I was to bring in, and the reason we are taking mosquitoes because we have different types of Plasmodium, the malarial larvae, as we call, which is essentially the Plasmodium, and different types can be discussed to talk about the transmission of disease in humans. Now, if I have to show you a diagram of how, say, for example, a Plasmodium looks like, this is what the Plasmodium looks like essentially under a microscope. So when we went into the cell structure of parasites yesterday, different types like virus, bacteria, protozoa, we looked at one of these structures wherein in the structure you see nucleus, which is your genetic material, your mitochondria, which is primarily your powerhouse of the cell. We see vacuoles, cytoplasm, ribosomes, and we had a couple of other, cell membrane and outer membrane and things like that. Now, if you look at this particular bit under the microscope, when you come into the class and when we show you some of the cultures under the microscope, this is how you would see the Plasmodium looks like in your body in red blood cells. So when we talk about these false colored, scans that you get to see, this is your Plasmodium actually replicating in your body. So in amongst your red blood cells. So these are toxins which it is releasing. And this is what are then starting to cause reaction, which is fever in your body. And these are essentially going to be unicellular eukaryotes, not prokaryotes, because eukaryotes are multicellular organisms. They are 100 to 10,000 times larger than the prokaryotes, and they are multi-celled. So as you can see, there are a number of them being released as the larvae, which is like a baby, starts multiplying. It starts releasing, these eukaryote cells. And these eukaryote cells essentially develop into what are called, parasite or Plasmodium, and they start feeding on the insects, or in this case, your host body, and they would be done through the bloodstream. So when we look at the red blood cells getting infected, and these red blood cells essentially looking at, then the Plasmodium, which is the larvae, which essentially the mosquito injects, at some stage when they start showing the reaction and they start reproducing in your body, that is where you start to get the reaction, and that is where you start to get the fever. And that is what we need to explain in this particular context of the assessment criteria, that how do vectors transmit diseases in humans. So when we talk about different types of Plasmodium which are carried by mosquitoes, Aedes, Culex, and Anopheles, the first one that we talk about is Falciparum. Falciparum is the most important larvae which gets transmitted by mosquitoes on having a mosquito bite, and this can lead to lots of deaths because of the malaria, and the symptom of the disease is called malaria. But the biological name of that larvae which gets transmitted from the mosquito to the human body is called Plasmodium falciparum. Now, this Plasmodium produces toxins which actually are fatal to the human body. So it produces poisonous toxins, and as the intensity of the replication of this Plasmodium or this particular parasite increases within the human body, the amount of toxin produces leads to fatality in humans if it is not treated by medication or by, say, for example, in some cases injections, because they are what the vaccination is trying to do is essentially reduce the or neutralize the toxins which this particular Plasmodium is producing in the body. The second type tends to be Plasmodium vivax. Now, this is the most widespread species, and this can cause a relapse of malarial fever in your body. Now, sometimes what tends to happen is that these vectors can become dormant in your body, because if the vaccination or the medication that you're having is overpowering them, what they can do is go into a dormant stage. That means they can become inactive. And when conducive conditions arrive again, and they can start multiplying and start infecting the body. So Plasmodium vivax basically is a species which basically can become dormant and stay within the body for up to 3 years. And at some stage, if it finds the conducive conditions, it can become active and then start causing the disease again. Then we talk about Plasmodium malariae. Now, this is a Plasmodium species which basically exists in our blood for a long period of time. And sometimes you see that once you have had a particular disease, you become immune to it for a number of years or number of decades. But it can also still produce symptoms over a point in time, or you might not be affected because your body has developed immunity to it, but you can still transmit this disease to somebody else who has not been affected or is not immune. So in those cases, when we look at blood transfusion in particular, we do see that sometimes when blood transfusion is done, it is tested for Plasmodium malariae, that do you have this particular type of pathogen in your blood, even though if it is in inactive form, and it requires certain conducive conditions like tropical climate or high temperatures for it to become active again. Now, if you do seem to have this, then the blood transfusion is normally not done, because this could be fatal to the host to which the blood transfusion is being done, and they could become active in that host because they find conducive conditions for them to be able to replicate and multiply. And the last one that we look at is Plasmodium ovale. Now, this is a rare, but one of the types of larvae which is also carried by mosquito. It also is predominantly found in only West Africa, and it can basically also cause fever. Now, this fever can also be fatal, but when we look at Plasmodium ovale in particular, this can cause infections within the humans because this is also a parasitic protozoan, and this also creates an illness called malaria. Now, here some of the key points which differentiate Plasmodium ovale from some of the other different types of species of Plasmodium malariae, vivax, or falciparum is that sorry, it is one of the type of protozoan species which is responsible for causing relapse of malaria in humans. And that is because it can transmit, remain dormant, and it can then transmit from humans, from one human to the other, or different forms of, essentially humans, but primarily because when it reoccurs or relapses, it basically causes, this parasite essentially stays within the liver of the human body, or stays within the liver as an organ in the human body. And this can cause secondary infections. Secondary infections could be infections which are related to malarial type of fever. It might not cause malaria, but it might cause different types of fever, because liver, which is one of the important glands in your body, secretes bile, which basically helps in digestion and breaking down of food that we eat in our body. So this particular plasmodium can essentially be causing different forms of infections within the human body. And for the purposes of understanding that why this is rare is because it is only found in West Africa. Plus, sometimes when these diseases come out in the open and obviously start infecting humans in large numbers, that is when only trials, or case reports and clinical observations are essentially done. And in those cases, what you will generally see is that the treatment for these kind of diseases is limited, but also focused only on that particular area because it is found within a certain set of population showing certain characteristics. So this particular protozoan can cause different forms of secondary infection within humans, and that is why, although being rare, that is why this is also something which is classified as a vector, which essentially is known to transmit or cause various types of fever-related diseases within humans. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So this brings us to the end of this particular assessment criteria, which is talking about how do vectors cause or transmit diseases in humans, and that's the only assessment criteria in today's discussion for the learning outcome 2. Now, what I would suggest is that one particular part would be as a bit of a homework or a self reading into a bit more on understanding vector-borne diseases, the type of pathogens, and what kind of disease and symptoms it causes in humans. I would suggest that you study this particular table and looking at the diseases, do a bit of research on your own using Google to actually get to understand what are these diseases. And say, for example, in certain cases, if you have come from certain parts of the world wherein you are aware that this is a particular issue or a disease which happens year on year during certain types of seasons, mostly during rainy seasons, when we look at malaria in particular, then it will be good to draw some, inflections from there, or essentially reflection from there when you start to do your assignment. And this research that you do would be useful at that point in time because you'll be able to not just bring in the technical evidence which is required, but also bring in a perspective as an example of what you've actually seen happening where in places that you have lived or in places that you've come from as a culture, or say for example say for example a country or a geography wherein it is something which is prominent, it is something which happens year on year, and that would be injecting practical emphasis into the task when you explain the task 2.1 or related assessment criteria in the assignment brief. Is that okay? So what I will do apart from this would be to try and see if I can give you a research paper which is primarily on say BBC. If I look at Bite Size, I don't know how many of you looked at BBC Bite Size website. I'll show that to you in a second. And some of the concepts that you want to read about, and obviously those BBC Bite Size website is quite popular with students who are actually studying for their GCSEs and A levels in terms of biology exams. Also go through this particular site. So this particular site that you look at, which is bbc.co.uk/bite size, has a biology guide and a cell biology guide, which I also sometimes refer to and look at, taking some bits from here to explain into my presentation as well. So this particular site and the link of this site, I will send you in WhatsApp, and this would be useful for you to primarily, study and look at from a point of view of understanding some of the bits that we are studying in this particular unit, which is infectious diseases. Okay. So we will meet up next week now to discuss learning outcome 3 and learning outcome 4 on Saturday and Sunday. But until then, this presentation, a copy of this lecture would be updated and obviously available to you through the Moodle. And what I would suggest is that you go ahead and read some of the bits that I've mentioned to you with regards to, the BBC Biteside website. And there are 3 links to articles that I put in on Moodle yesterday in particular. And those ones I would suggest you should go ahead and read. Let me show you that very briefly on Moodle. And they would be giving you more knowledge and detail into what we are discussing through the route of, discussing the, this particular learning outcome and learning outcome 1. So when you go into the nursing course, and you go down to infectious diseases. So what I've done is, if you see learning outcome 1 presentation, which was updated yesterday, is put up here. If I just show that to you. So if you see this bit, which is here, in terms of learning outcome 1, that you see here. This is the copy of the recorded session from yesterday. This is the link to an article on the NCBI website, and then obviously some details on eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So I'll be uploading the learning outcome 2 presentation and also put the link to the BBC Bitesize website so that you're able to refer to it and, obviously read some of the relevant sections related to, I would say, learning outcome 1 and 2. And I'll see you next week to discuss further when we go into learning outcome 3 and 4. Let me just put this up here.
That's fine.
So these are all now updated on the Moodle. And what I'll do is do away with the second presentation. I'll put the copy of the recording link also shortly here so that you are able to, access everything from the Moodle itself. So thank you so much for attending. Any questions at this stage today, please let me know.
So you upload the link as well?
Yes, I will upload the link as well. I do it for every section that I do.
Yeah.
So yesterday's session is here. When you click on this, it'll take you to the recording of the session which we did yesterday. And I'll upload the session 1 as well.
Okay.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you. Take care.